Boston, December 16, 1773. A moonless sky hung over the harbor where 3 British ships lay anchored, their holds heavy with tea, their decks watched by red-coated sentinels. On the cold air drifted whispers of rebellion. That night, ordinary men, blacksmiths, merchants, apprentices, wrapped themselves in blankets and feathers, disguising their faces. But they were not thieves. They came not for riches, but for justice. When their axes struck the chests of British tea, the splash that followed was more than water breaking. It was the sound of empire cracking. This is the story of defiance that awakened a nation, the Boston Tea Party. Now, let's unfold this story in 7 parts. Part 1, The Brewing Storm, 1763 to 1773. The story of the Boston Tea Party begins not with tea, but with war. From 1754 to 1763, Britain fought alongside the American colonists in the French and Indian War, a brutal conflict for control of North America. Victory came at a price. Britain now controlled vast new territories, but also carried a crushing war debt exceeding £130 million. The British Parliament, desperate for revenue, turned to its colonies. They benefit from our protection, the ministers reasoned. They must share the cost. So came the Sugar Act of 1764, placing duties on sugar and molasses imported into the colonies. Then the Stamp Act of 1765, which required that every newspaper, contract, and even playing card carry a British stamp, proof that the tax had been paid. To London, this was reasonable. To Boston, it was tyranny. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament. They were being taxed by a government thousands of miles away, a government they did not elect. And thus rose a cry that would echo through history: no taxation without representation. Across New England, meetings and protests spread like wildfire. Pamphlets denounced the injustice. British tax collectors were harassed. Effigies hung from trees. In Boston, resistance found its heart in the Sons of Liberty, a secret group of artisans, merchants, and patriots, led by men like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere. They used words as weapons, organizing boycotts, spreading propaganda, and uniting colonies against British control. Their power grew with every British misstep. When the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, after furious opposition, celebrations filled the streets. But the joy didn't last long. Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that it had the full right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Then came the Townshend Acts, 1767, taxing glass, paper, lead, paint, and tea. British troops landed in Boston in 1768 to enforce them. Red-coated soldiers now marched through colonial streets, a daily reminder of oppression. Tensions flared. Insults turned to violence. On March 5, 1770, snow fell on King Street. An angry crowd surrounded British sentries. Taunts, snowballs, and clubs were thrown. Then, a musket fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. Among them, Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, became one of America's first martyrs. The event became known as the Boston Massacre, and it inflamed every heart in the colonies. Though Parliament repealed most of the Townshend taxes soon after, it kept one: the tax on tea. A small symbolic duty, but to the colonists it was an insult, a deliberate reminder of subjugation. And that single act, a penny tax on tea, would soon spark revolution. Boston grew restless. Newspapers fanned the flames of defiance. Every tavern and meeting hall buzzed with talk of liberty and injustice. And beneath the surface, something powerful was brewing. Not just anger, but unity. By 1773, the storm was ready to break.
Part 2. The East India Company's Gamble, 1773. Across the ocean, in the marble halls of London, the world's most powerful trading company was dying. Anchor, the empire's burden. By the early 1770s, the British East India Company, once the jewel of imperial commerce, was collapsing. It had conquered lands, ruled over millions in India, and flooded Europe with silk, spices, and tea. But corruption and war drained its coffers. By 1772, the company faced bankruptcy. The directors turned to Parliament, pleading for salvation. The government saw both danger and opportunity. Britain relied on the East India Company, not just for trade, but for control. If the company fell, thousands of investors, many from Parliament itself, would lose fortunes. The empire's prestige would falter. And so, a plan was born. In May 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, not to oppress the colonies, but to save the company. It allowed the East India Company to ship its massive surplus of tea directly to America, without paying import duties in England. The goal? Sell tea cheaper than smugglers could, undercut Dutch black market imports, reassert British authority quietly through profit. But the plan carried poison in its leaves. Tea, the deception of the Tea Act. To the men in London, it was simple economics. To the colonists, it was a trap. The Tea Act still included the tax from the Townshend Acts, the one that symbolized Parliament's right to tax the colonies without representation. So even though the tea would be cheaper, buying it meant accepting Parliament's authority. And that, the colonists refused to do. In taverns, on street corners, and in newspapers, a wave of outrage spread. Pamphlets warned of the snare of cheap tea. To drink it was to surrender liberty. Boston's leading patriot, Samuel Adams, thundered against the scheme. What a glorious opportunity is now offered to the virtuous sons of liberty of defeating the design of their oppressors. Adams understood what the Tea Act really meant. If the colonists accepted this tea, Britain would gain not just revenue, but moral victory. It would prove the colonies could be tempted and subdued. Anchor, the arrival of the tea ships. Autumn 1773. Across the Atlantic, the East India Company dispatched 4 ships bound for America. The Dartmouth, bound for Boston. The Eleanor, following close behind. The Beaver, delayed by smallpox but soon to arrive. The William, destined for Philadelphia. Each ship carried hundreds of chests of tea, thousands of pounds of taxable leaves. When news reached the colonies that the ships were coming, a cry went up from New York to Charleston. No, the tea shall not be landed. In Philadelphia and New York, the pressure worked. Merchants refused the cargoes. The ships turned back to England. But in Boston, things were different. Governor Hutchinson, a proud loyalist with deep ties to the crown, refused to yield. He ordered that the tea ships not leave the harbor until the cargo was unloaded and the duties paid. The Sons of Liberty saw the governor's defiance as betrayal. Rumors spread that his sons were among the official tea consignees. Boston seethed with fury. Anchor, the whispers of rebellion. Meetings filled the city. In Faneuil Hall, known as the Cradle of Liberty, hundreds have gathered to protest. When the crowd outgrew the hall, they moved to the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in Boston. There, under the flicker of candlelight, thousands of colonists debated what to do. John Hancock, one of Boston's wealthiest merchants, stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers and tradesmen. Samuel Adams, his voice steady but burning with conviction, spoke. The tea must not be landed. It must be returned to London. This meeting can do nothing more to save our country. But Governor Hutchinson refused. He ordered the ships to remain until the tea tax was paid. And by law, if the cargo was not unloaded after 20 days, it could be seized by customs officials and the duties enforced by the British Navy. The deadline approached, December 16, 1773. Boston waited, trembling between hope and war. Anchor, the eve of defiance. By early December, the harbor was locked with 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Each carried tea, each guarded by British customs officers. Night after night, men patrolled the docks. Meetings continued at the Old South Meeting House. Letters flew between Boston and other colonies, warning of what might come. And in taverns lit with firelights, whispers turned to plans. The Sons of Liberty met in secret, their numbers growing. Paul Revere, silversmith and courier, carried coded messages across town. Others prepared disguises, blankets, soot, feathers, to mask their faces. No one yet spoke openly of destroying the tea, but the thought lingered, heavy in the cold December air. Anchor, the moment of choice. By the afternoon of December 16th, more than 5,000 colonists packed the Old South Meeting House, a crowd larger than the population of most colonial towns. Outside, snow began to fall. The harbor wind howled the narrow streets. For hours, they debated. Could the tea ships be forced to leave? Could the governor be persuaded? A messenger arrived from the governor's mansion. Hutchinson's words were final. The ships will not be cleared. The tea must be landed and the duty paid. A murmur swept the crowd. Anger, disbelief, resolve. Then, as twilight fell, Samuel Adams rose to speak. He looked out at the packed room, merchants, farmers, apprentices, and declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save our country." A signal phrase. Outside, a shout rang out, a cry that would soon echo through eternity. Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight. The decision had been made, not by kings or governors, but by ordinary men. And in that instant, the course of history turned toward revolution.
Part 3. The Night of the Mohawks, December 16, 1773. Night fell upon Boston, cold, sharp, and silent. In the harbor, 3 ships swayed against their moorings, their holds heavy with East India tea. The deadline had passed. The governor had refused. The people had decided. Now, it was time to act. The gathering shadows. As the final meeting at the Old South Meeting House ended, the crowd spilled into the streets, thousands strong. The air trembled with anticipation and purpose. From the direction of Milk Street, Dock Square, and the North End, men began to move, silently, quickly. They came in small groups, cloaked in blankets, faces blackened with soot or paint. Some wore feathers, others carried hatchets, clubs, or torches. To the onlookers, they appeared as Mohawk Indians, the chosen disguise of the Sons of Liberty. But the disguise was not mockery. It was symbolic. In that moment, these colonists shed their identities as British subjects and took on the spirit of something older, freer, and native to the land. Among them were Samuel Cooper, George Hughes, Thomas Melville, and Lendell Pitts, ordinary tradesmen and patriots. There were no uniforms, no generals, no flags, only men of Boston, bound by a shared oath. Quote, "No property shall be destroyed, except the tea. No man shall steal. We act for liberty, not for loot. March to the harbor. At about 6 o'clock, the drums began to beat, slow, rhythmic, echoing down the cobblestone streets. Hundreds of onlookers followed as the disguised men marched toward Griffin's Wharf. The snow had stopped, and a pale moon glimmered on the icy harbor water. There, in the distance, waited the three ships: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. British customs officers stood watch, unaware of the storm about to break.
"Who goes there?" A voice answered firmly, "The Mohawks." And with that cry, the rebellion began. The men boarded the ships in organized teams. Each ship assigned its own group, each man knowing his task. There was no chaos, no drunkenness, no wild rioting. The operation was precise, disciplined, and deliberate. Paul Revere stood on the shore, ready to ride with the news if British troops intervened. The destruction begins. One by one, the chests of tea, 342 in total, were hauled from the holds. Each chest weighed around 90 pounds. Axes split them open, spilling the compressed tea leaves onto the deck. Then, with powerful swings, the men heaved the tea overboard. The sea turned dark, not with blood, but with the bitter scent of rebellion. Witnesses said the tide carried the tea out across the harbor, forming small floating islands of leaves that stained the shore black for days. Honor among rebels. Throughout the night, the discipline of the protest astonished even its enemies. When one man attempted to slip some tea into his coat pocket, he was caught and publicly shamed by his companions. The tea was thrown back into the harbor and order was restored. Another account tells of a broken padlock on one of the ships. The next morning, the Sons of Liberty replaced it at their own expense, proof that their war was against tyranny, not property. By 10 o'clock, the task was complete. Not a single crate remained. The decks were swept clean, the holds closed. The Mohawks formed ranks and quietly marched away into the night. No one was killed. No shots were fired. No buildings burned. Only the tea, the symbol of unjust power, lie buried beneath the black waves of Boston Harbor. The silent aftermath. As the rebels disappeared into the alleys, the harbor lay eerily still. The cold wind whispered through the rigging of the empty ships. In the distance, church bells tolled. Boston slept, unaware that history had just changed forever. Somewhere in the darkness, Samuel Adams stood at his window, looking toward the harbor. He turned to a friend and said quietly, "You have now had the destruction of the tea. Next will come the determination of Great Britain to subdue us." He was right. The splash of that tea into the harbor would echo across oceans, to Parliament, to the King, and soon to every battlefield of the coming revolution.
Part 4. The Empire Strikes Back, 1774. By morning, the water was calm again. The ships floated lighter, emptied of their cargo. But beneath the still surface, the tide of revolution had begun to turn. On the morning after, on December 17, 1773, Boston awoke to a strange silence. In the harbor, tea leaves clung to the shoreline, staining the snow black. The scent of the yeast, once luxury, now symbolized rebellion. Word spread quickly through the town. Men who had been seen near the wharf the night before walked quietly through the streets, saying little, offering no confession. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, furious and humiliated, wrote immediately to London. "The people are in open rebellion. The laws are trampled underfoot. I fear the next step will be revolution." He was not wrong. Within weeks, news of the event, which the British press mockingly called the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor, reached London. The Empire's response would be swift, merciless, and decisive. The outrage in London. In early 1774, Parliament gathered under gray winter skies. The chamber seethed with indignation. King George III, reading the reports from Massachusetts, declared, "The die is cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." To him, this was not a protest, it was treason. Lord North, the British Prime Minister, stood before Parliament and thundered, "We must teach these insolent Americans that the authority of this kingdom shall not be defied." And thus a new wave of legislation was born. Laws meant not to punish individuals, but to break the spirit of an entire city.
The Coercive Acts, Britain's Iron Fist. Between March and June 1774, Parliament passed a series of measures the colonists would soon call the Intolerable Acts. 1. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor entirely until the destroyed tea was paid for in full. No ships could enter or leave, trade stopped, fishermen starved, merchants went bankrupt. 2. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-government. Town meetings, the very heart of democracy, were banned without royal approval. 3. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, not in the colonies. To the colonists, this meant immunity for tyranny. 4. The Quartering Act forced Bostonians to house British soldiers in their homes. And finally, to tighten control over the region, Britain appointed General Thomas Gage, commander of all British forces in North America, as the new governor of Massachusetts. He arrived with thousands of troops, redcoats gleaming, bayonets sharp, and transformed Boston into an occupied city. Boston under siege. By summer, Boston's harbor was empty, its docks silent. Where once the cries of sailors and merchants filled the air, now only the tramp of soldiers' boots echoed through the streets. Ships carrying supplies were turned away, families went hungry, shops closed. Even the poor who depended on fishing and trade suffered cruelly. In the heart of the city, British sentries guarded the wharves with fixed bayonets. Any attempt to defy them was met with threats of arrest. But oppression has a strange effect on the human spirit. It either crushes it or hardens it beyond breaking. In Boston, it did the latter. Rather than weaken the rebellion, Britain's punishment forged unity.
Part 5. Voices of Revolution, 1774 to 1775. In the autumn of 1774, while Boston lay starving under siege, 56 men gathered in Philadelphia. They came from towns and plantations, from bustling ports and quiet farms. They came not as rebels, not yet, but as Englishmen pleading for justice. Their words, however, would soon give birth to a new nation. The First Continental Congress. On September 5, 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Only Georgia, still reliant on British military aid against local tribes, did not attend. The men assembled were of different tempers and backgrounds: merchants, lawyers, planters, ministers. Among them, George Washington, tall and silent, a soldier of duty and restraint. Patrick Henry, fiery and eloquent, with words sharp as muskets. John Adams, meticulous and determined, his pen and intellect keen as steel. Samuel Adams, Boston's radical spirit, his eyes fierce with conviction. John Jay, calm and diplomatic, seeking reason where others foresaw war. They gathered not in grandeur, but in secrecy, in a modest brick building beneath candlelight, guarded by silence and fear of spies. The King's Response. In January 1775, as the new year dawned cold and uncertain,
The petitions from the colonies reached the British Parliament. King George III read the appeals, then turned to his ministers. His face, usually calm and composed, grew hard. "The die is cast," he said again. "The colonies must either submit or triumph." To him, resistance was rebellion, and rebellion, in the eyes of the crown, meant war. Orders were sent to General Thomas Gage in Boston. Use all force necessary to restore order and obedience. Boston, the powder keg. Boston, still suffering under blockade, had become a garrison city. Redcoats marched through the streets daily, their drums echoing between shuttered windows. Patriot meetings were outlawed, newspapers censored, but resistance did not die. It went underground. In taverns and secret rooms, the Sons of Liberty met nightly. They stored muskets and powder in nearby towns, Lexington, Concord, Worcester, under the watch of local militias known as Minutemen. Paul Revere, the silversmith and messenger, rode from village to village, mapping the roads and organizing couriers. Each night, more men pledged themselves to the cause of freedom. They were farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, men with no uniforms, no pay, and no promise of victory. But they carried a weapon more powerful than muskets: conviction. Give me liberty or give me death. By March 1775, the colonies were trembling on the edge of war. In Richmond, Virginia, at St. John's Church, the colony's delegates gathered to discuss whether to prepare for defense. The room was filled with unease. Many still hoped for peace. Then, Patrick Henry stood. His eyes burned with fire, his voice rising like thunder. "Gentlemen may cry, 'Peace, peace,' but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." His words electrified the colonies. They spread through pamphlets and sermons, from taverns to church pulpits, igniting the hearts of men and women who had once feared rebellion. The spirit of resistance. Throughout New England, militias drilled openly. Blacksmiths worked late into the night, forging bullets and repairing muskets. Women gathered supplies and spun homespun cloth for soldiers not yet called. Even in the countryside, children played at war, wooden muskets in hand, shouting "Liberty forever" as they ran through the fields. The spirit of independence, once confined to radicals in Boston, now lived in every corner of the colonies. The calm before the storm. In Boston, General Gage prepared his troops. He had orders to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders, particularly Samuel Adams and John Hancock. At the same time, Patriot spies kept watch on every British movement. Paul Revere and Dr. Joseph Warren coordinated a vast intelligence network, listening, waiting. Something was coming. No one knew when, but everyone knew it could no longer be stopped. The words of Samuel Adams echoed in every heart. "If our trade be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands and everything we possess or make use of? This is reason enough to rebel."
Part 6. The Shot Heard Round the World, April 1775. Narrator. Low, tense tone. Night had fallen over Boston. In the darkened homes of patriots, candles burned low, waiting, watching. British troops were preparing to march. And in that silence, one man was ready to ride into history. Candobian Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. It was April 18th, 1775. General Thomas Gage,
acting on secret orders from London, had made his decision. He would seize the weapons stored by colonial militias in Concord and arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the leaders of rebellion, hiding in Lexington. British officers moved quietly through Boston's streets. Boats were made ready to cross the Charles River. Muskets and powder were loaded in silence. But the Patriots had spies everywhere. Dr. Joseph Warren, a trusted friend of the Sons of Liberty, sent word to Paul Revere, the silversmith and courier. Revere understood at once. The redcoats were moving. He hurried to the North End, where 2 lanterns were raised in the steeple of Old North Church, the secret signal agreed upon days earlier. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. As the light shone across the river, Revere mounted his horse. Through the night he rode, through Charlestown, Medford, and Lexington, shouting into the darkness, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" Doors burst open, candles flickered to life. Farmers grabbed their muskets, pulling on coats as they ran to alert their neighbors. The countryside awoke. Village after village, alarm bells ringing, drums beating. By dawn, thousands of militia were stirring. The British Army was no longer marching toward a sleeping colony. It was riding into an armed people.
The Battle of Lexington. Before sunrise on April 19th, around 700 British troops, led by Major John Pitcairn, reached Lexington Green. There, waiting in the pale light, stood 77 colonial militiamen, commanded by Captain John Parker, a farmer and veteran of earlier wars. He looked at his men, shopkeepers, fathers, young apprentices, their hands trembling around their muskets. "Stand your ground," he told them, his voice steady. "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The redcoats marched into view, bayonets gleaming. They formed ranks opposite the militia. For a moment, all was still. Then, a shot. No one knew who fired it, a spark in the chaos, but that single sound shattered the peace of an empire. The British volleyed. Smoke filled the air. When it cleared, 8 Americans lay dead, and 10 more wounded. The redcoats cheered and marched on toward Concord. The war for liberty had begun. The Battle of Concord. By the time the British reached Concord, hundreds of militia from nearby towns had gathered. They watched from the hills as redcoats searched for hidden arms. At the North Bridge, a column of about 90 British soldiers faced 400 armed colonists. Both sides shouted warnings. Both claimed they did not wish to fight. Then, a shot cracked through the morning air, this time from the British line. "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" someone cried. The colonists returned fire, deadly and precise. 2 British soldiers fell instantly. It was the first organized exchange of the American Revolution. As the redcoats retreated, militiamen fired from behind walls and trees, from barns and hedgerows. The long road back to Boston became a gauntlet of vengeance. By the end of the day, nearly 300 British soldiers were killed or wounded, while fewer than 100 colonists fell. The mighty British Army, unchallenged for generations, had been driven back by farmers and tradesmen. The world reacts. Word spread like lightning across the colonies. Riders carried the news through Connecticut, New York, and Pennsylvania. In every town, church bells rang and men gathered their muskets. Benjamin Franklin, hearing the news in Philadelphia, wrote, "The blow is struck and we shall prevail." In London, ministers were shocked. King George III, upon hearing of the battles, reportedly exclaimed, "The die is now cast. The colonies are in a state of rebellion." No longer were the Americans protesting taxes or laws. They were fighting for survival. The Siege of Boston. Within days, thousands of New England militiamen surrounded Boston, trapping the British inside the city. What began as a protest over tea had become a siege, the first major act of war in the struggle for independence. George Washington, upon hearing the call, left his Virginia plantation and rode north. He did not yet know it, but soon he would be chosen to lead these men, to forge them into an army and guide them through the fire of revolution.
Part 7. From Rebellion to Revolution, 1775 to 1776. From the midnight ride to the fields of Lexington and Concord, the colonies had tasted battle and blood. The die was cast. The world's greatest empire had been challenged by farmers and tradesmen. But could this defiance become freedom? Could these scattered provinces become a nation? The Second Continental Congress. On May 10, 1775, delegates once again gathered in Philadelphia. But this time, the mood was different. The men who had once pleaded for reconciliation now arrived under the shadow of war. News from Boston was dire. British troops were trapped inside the city, but the colonial militias, tens of thousands strong, were disorganized, poorly supplied, and leaderless. It was clear. If the colonies were to survive, they needed unity. Among those present were familiar names: John Adams, Samuel Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Patrick Henry, and new faces like Thomas Jefferson, the young Virginian with quiet brilliance.
Washington takes command. On July 3, 1775, Washington arrived in Cambridge to take command of the Continental Army. He found chaos, untrained men, few supplies, and little discipline. But his presence transformed them. He rode among the troops each morning, his blue coat immaculate, his bearing calm. He demanded order, respect, and sacrifice, and he gave the same in return. Quote, "Discipline is the soul of an army," he declared. "It makes small numbers formidable." Under his leadership, the ragtag militias began to look like soldiers. Through the freezing winter and hunger, they dug trenches, built fortifications, and held fast. By March 1776, using cannons hauled from Fort Ticonderoga by Henry Knox, Washington forced the British to evacuate Boston entirely. The city that had witnessed oppression, massacre, and protest was now free. As the redcoats sailed away, church bells rang out. Samuel Adams watched from the harbor and whispered, "This is the dawn of a new world." And birth of independence. But the question remained, what were they fighting for? At first, many still hoped for reconciliation. Yet after King George III's declaration that the colonies were in open rebellion, and after British troops burned towns like Falmouth and Norfolk, patience turned to fury. It was time to break free. In early 1776, a pamphlet appeared that would shake the colonies to their core: Thomas Paine's Common Sense. In clear, powerful language, Paine declared, quote, "The cause of America is, in great measure, the cause of all mankind. 'Tis time to part." His words spread like wildfire. Farmers, sailors, women, and ministers read them aloud in taverns and churches. The idea of independence, once radical, became inevitable. By June, the Continental Congress formed a committee to draft a formal declaration. Its youngest member, Thomas Jefferson, was chosen to write it. For 17 days, Jefferson wrote in his rented room in Philadelphia, his desk piled with notes and drafts. He drew upon the ideas of John Locke, the courage of Samuel Adams, and the hopes of every colonist who had suffered under British rule. When he finished, his words would change the world. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. On July 4, 1776, the Congress approved the document. The room fell silent as John Hancock signed first, his name bold and defiant. The bell in the Pennsylvania State House rang out. Crowds gathered in the streets, cheering and weeping. The United States of America was born. The legacy of the Boston Tea Party. It had begun years earlier with a single act of protest. Men disguised as Mohawks dumping tea into Boston Harbor. They had not sought bloodshed. They had sought fairness, dignity, representation. But their act became the spark that lit the fuse of revolution. From the Boston Tea Party to the Declaration of Independence, every march, every meeting, every drop of tea and blood shed on the streets of Boston led to this moment: a people claiming the right to govern themselves. Quote, "The revolution was in the hearts and minds of the people. It was before a drop of blood was shed. It was in the change in their principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections.